Senator Woo.
Thank you, Your Honour. Let me start by thanking my friend Senator Dean for his wise stewardship of the bill, and my friend Senator Dagenet for allowing me to sit in SECD during the pre-study as an observer. Colleagues, you will have received earlier today a heads up that I will move an amendment to C-70 to remove the phrase "in association with" from the bill. Before I do so, let me take a few minutes to explain why I think it is necessary. There are 6 references to that phrase in both parts 2 and 4 of the bill. For example, the words "in association with" is part of the definition of arrangements in the Foreign Influence, Transparency and Accountability Act. The Act requires persons to register and provide information, quote, "in relation to arrangements entered into with foreign states or powers and their proxies under which persons undertake to carry out certain activities in relation to political or governmental processes in Canada," unquote. It defines arrangement as under which a person undertakes to carry out, under the direction of or in association with a foreign principal, unquote. We have received clarification from officials that arrangements includes not only formal contracts, but other kinds of arrangements that are less explicit. Here is what an official from the Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness Department said. Quote, "An arrangement wouldn't need to be a written contract. It wouldn't necessarily need to be spelled out on paper. It can be a verbal understanding. Ultimately, it would be up to the Commissioner, based on the facts available to them, to determine whether there was an understanding, an arrangement, an agreement to conduct these influence activities. It's purposely drafted in a way to not limit it just to one contract that says, I will pay you X to do Y," unquote. In other words, the concept of arrangement is already very elastic. This is as it should be, since we have a lobbyist registry which would already require anyone who formally represents a foreign power to register under that measure. The new Foreign Influence Transparency Registry would close loopholes in the lobbyist registry, both by expanding the scope of covered activities and by using a broad definition of arrangements. What then is the point of adding the phrase "in association with" to this definition of arrangements? Where does the phrase come from anyway? It turns out that this phrase is taken from the Criminal Code pertaining to the commission of offence for criminal organizations. In the Code 467.12(1), it says, "Every person who commits an indictable offence under this or any other Act of Parliament for the benefit of, at the direction of, or in association with a criminal organization is guilty of an indictable offence and liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 14 years," unquote. There is some jurisprudence around the term "in association with." In R versus Ruzick 2001, the Supreme Court explains that there is an implicit requirement that the accused committed the predicate offence with the intent to do so for the benefit of, at the direction of, or in association with a group he or she knew had the composition of a criminal organization. In R versus Veneri 2012, the Supreme Court highlighted the underlying principles behind the terms "in association with" and "benefit" and "at direction of." The court says that the terms have a shared purpose, that their common objective, quote, "is to suppress organized crime," and that, quote, "to this end, they especially target offences that are connected to the activities of criminal organizations and advance their interests," unquote. These rulings refer to the suppression of organized crime and the activities of criminal organizations. The fitter, however, is not a registry of organized crime and criminal organizations. It is a transparency registry intended to encourage persons and organizations lobbying on behalf of a foreign principal to be transparent about their activities. Those activities are not illegal. They are certainly not criminal. The fitter, after all, is not meant to be a blacklist. It is rather a whitelist. In fact, one of the features of C-70 is that anyone who is in compliance with the registry can legitimately carry out the political interference activities listed in Part 2 of C-70. The words "in association with" may have some utility in the prosecution of individuals involved in criminal gangs, but it is not helpful for the purposes of the FITA. On the contrary, the use of this criteria will force the Commissioner to look for a foreign influence analog to organized crime. And how will he or she do that? I believe it will boil down to the views expressed by the person suspected of being in association with, even if the point of the registry is not about screening for good or bad points of view. This has already been seen to be a problem in criminal cases where offences using the "in association with" term have allowed conduct to be criminalized that only has a tenuous connection to a criminal organization. Take the case of so-called malign foreign influence that was highlighted in the Minister of Public Safety's consultation paper on the registry that we now have in C-70. It paints a scenario whereby a Canadian academic is asked by an individual employed by a foreign government to write an op-ed opposing a position taken by the federal government without disclosing the foreign actor's request to do so. This example sent shivers down my spine. It suggests that Canadians who have interactions with foreign governments are servile dupes who have no capacity for individual judgment or agency. How do we know that the Canadian did not already share the view of the foreign government? Or if he or she may have, in fact, influenced the foreign agent rather than the other way around? The reality is that the Commissioner of the Registry will be hard-pressed to determine if there was any direction from the foreign agent to the academic. The Commissioner may have information about contact between the agent and the academic, but in the absence of information about direction, he or she will have to guess if the academic was in association with that agent. And the likely starting point for such an assessment will be the views expressed by the academic. The government is passing the buck to the Commissioner to determine how to define a vague and problematic term and counting on the courts to fix any excess. But we should not go down this road in the first place by inviting the Commissioner to do such a task. And we can stop it by removing the words "in association with" as part of the definition of arrangements with a foreign principal. Honourable colleagues, if you think this is a marginal case study, let me give you an example that is closer to home. When MPs and senators travel as part of an interparliamentary association to another country, they invariably meet with foreign principals who will bend the ears of their Canadian counterparts on policy issues that are important to them. And very often, the Canadian parliamentarians will return to Ottawa and pass those messages to the responsible minister, to a senior bureaucrat, or the party caucus. I have heard Hill colleagues advocate for lower cheese tariffs after a visit to the UK, or a change in wine import quotas after visiting Wellington, or the need to invest in LNG export facilities after going to Berlin, or a plea to support Taiwan's participation in the World Health Assembly after a sponsored trip to Taiwan. Are the MPs and senators in association with the foreign power? And do they have to register with FITA? After all, they are members of an association that explicitly seeks to influence and be influenced by their counterparts. Perhaps you agree with the policy proposals advocated by the Brits, the Gerbans, the Kiwis, and the Taiwanese, and are therefore inclined to discount the need for registration. But what if a parliamentary delegation came back from Beijing and advocated for more flights between Canada and China? Or if they lobbied for Canada to not follow the lead of the United States to impose massive tariffs on Chinese EVs? Would those examples make you more inclined to insist on registration? On the face of the bill, MPs and senators are not exempt from registration in FITA. Now, perhaps the Commissioner will issue a ruling to give us all a pass. But what about our staffers? And what about the numerous hundreds of bilateral and multilateral business associations in Canada that do very similar work as our interparliamentary associations and which regularly meet with foreign officials to hear their views on policy issues that affect bilateral relations? Will members of the Canada-EU or Canada-Japan or Canada-US or Canada-Africa Business Association have to register if they trigger any of the three criteria under FITA? Just last week, the Business Council of Canada sent a letter to the Prime Minister warning that Canada faces, quote, diplomatic isolation in NATO if it doesn't meet its defense spending target of 2%. Now, I presume that Mr. Haider, the CEO of BCC, believes that we will face diplomatic isolation because he has had conversations with NATO leaders. I am sure Mr. Haider is not directed by those governments to lobby Ottawa, but can it not be said that he and his organization is in association with NATO governments in conveying such a message? And what about the hundreds of cultural, clan, and civil society organizations in Canada that have intrinsic links with foreign governments and which may, from time to time, engage with public officials? Let me be clear. If any of these groups have an arrangement or are acting at the direction of a foreign power, they should register. But in the absence of meeting such tests, does it make sense to use the woollier concept of in association with to force them to register? You might think that it isn't a big deal if parliamentarians, business associations, cultural and civil society groups have to register. So what if the term in association with captures a very broad swath of individuals and groups? But bear in mind that the phrase in association with also appears in Part 2 of the bill dealing with political interference, for which the consequences are not trivial at all. The use of in association with could ensnare Canadians in criminal cases related to political interference because of their views or connections, with the threat of a maximum penalty of life imprisonment. The open-ended nature of the phrase in association with will incline the Commissioner investigators to look at the backgrounds and views expressed by suspected agents as a proxy for being in association. And even if they don't specifically go in that direction, there will be public pressure on them, including snitching and rumor mills, to make judgments about who should be required to register based on the views they hold and the groups they associate with. This is how McCarthyism started. If you have any doubt that this will happen, I offer myself as a case study. Yesterday, I learned that the Chinese-Canadian Concern Group on the Chinese Communist Party's human rights violation has written to the Commissioner of the Public Inquiry and Foreign Interference to question my loyalty and that of our former colleague, Senator Victor O. To be specific, the Concern Group has urged the Commissioner to review my participation in the Commission by, quote, taking into consideration his past comments and associations. I suppose I should thank the Concern Group for providing me with such an egregious and timely example of stigmatization based on my, quote, past comments and associations. You can be sure that if C-70 is passed, they and others will use the phrase in association with to stigmatize many other Canadians who have much fewer protections than I have. Indeed, they have already recklessly named other Chinese Canadians in the letter and cast them as possible foreign agents with zero evidence. Therefore, I move that Bill C-70 be not now read a third time, but that it be amended. A, in clause 53.1 on page 26 by replacing line 28 with the following: correction or for the benefit of A4. 2 on page 28 by replacing lines 8 and 9 with the following: outside Canada at the direction of, for the benefit of a foreign entity or a terrorist group. In 3 on page 29A by replacing line 11 with the following: correction or for the benefit of A4. B by replacing lines 27 and 28 with the following: who at the direction of, for the benefit of a foreign entity, knowingly engages in surreptite. 4 on page 30 by replacing line 14 with the following: who at the direction of a foreign. B in clause 113 on page 75 by replacing lines 5 and 6 with the following: person undertakes to carry out under direction of a foreign principal any of the following. Colleagues, I thank you for your attention. I hope you will support my amendment.